Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The sun over Cancun rose the way it always did in July, spreading gold across turquoise water that seemed too perfect to belong to the real world. It was the kind of light that vacationers photographed and posted online with captions about paradise. The kind of light that made ordinary lives feel, for a week at least, like something out of a postcard. On the morning of July 18, 2021, Elijah Snow and his wife Jamie stepped off a plane at Cancun International Airport into that very light, tired from an early departure out of Dallas-Fort Worth, but buzzing with the particular excitement that comes from 10 years of marriage and a promise finally kept. Elijah was 35 years old, a firefighter from Arlington, Texas, a man whose job was to run toward danger so that other people could run away from it. He had spent a decade pulling people from burning buildings and car wrecks, the kind of work that demands a steady heart and a willingness to face the worst moments of strangers' lives. Jamie had been by his side through all of it, through the odd hours and the sleepless nights after hard calls, through the raising of 2 children and the slow accumulation of a life built together. Their 10th wedding anniversary was not just a date on a calendar. It was a milestone they had planned to mark somewhere far from home, somewhere that felt like a reward for everything they had weathered together. They chose Cancun, and they chose an all-inclusive resort called the Royalton Chic, booked through a small Texas travel agency named Let's Go on Vacu. There is a particular kind of trust that people place in a vacation like this one. They trust the travel agency to have vetted the destination. They trust the resort to have thought through their safety. They trust that the biggest risk of the week will be sunburn or an upset stomach from unfamiliar food. Nobody boards that flight thinking they might not board the one home. Jamie certainly did not. As she and Elijah checked into the Royalton Chic around 10 that morning, they were handed the plastic wristbands that marked them as all-inclusive guests, bands that granted them access to unlimited food and, crucially, unlimited alcohol at every bar on the property. It was meant to be a symbol of indulgence, of a week where nothing was rationed and nothing was denied. In hindsight, for the family that would spend the next 4 years fighting for answers, that same bracelet would become a symbol of something else entirely. A business model that profited from excess without accounting for its consequences. The first day passed the way first days at resorts often do, a blur of unpacking, exploring the grounds, finding a spot by the pool, toasting the anniversary with the kind of drinks that come with little umbrellas. By evening, the couple made their way to the hotel lobby bar. They ordered drinks. They talked. The details of exactly how many drinks Elijah had, and how quickly, is not disputed is that the bar kept serving, because the bracelet on his wrist told the bartenders that unlimited pours were exactly what the resort had promised him. At some point that evening, the couple started back toward their room. Then Elijah stopped in the hallway and turned back toward the bar. It was a small, seemingly unremarkable decision, the kind people make on vacation without a second thought. Jamie, tired from the travel and the day, went on to their room without him and fell asleep, expecting him to follow shortly after. It was the last time she would see her husband alive. Jamie woke around 4 in the morning. The other side of the bed was empty. Elijah had not come back. In the disoriented half-consciousness of a strange hotel room in a strange country, she likely told herself there was an explanation, that he had fallen asleep somewhere on a lounge chair, that he had gotten turned around in an unfamiliar building after one too many celebratory drinks. She began to search. She checked the places a wandering husband might end up, walked the grounds, asked staff if they had seen him. Nothing. As the hours ticked forward and the tropical dawn broke fully into daylight, worry hardened into fear. She reported him missing and reached out to hotel staff and eventually to Mexican authorities. At around 8:30 that morning, someone came to tell her they had found him. Not the words a wife wants to hear, delivered not with compassion, but with the clinical detachment of hotel staff managing a problem. Elijah was dead. He had not fallen asleep on a lounge chair. He had not wandered off and gotten lost in the maze of resort hallways. He had been found by a groundskeeper wedged into a window at a neighboring hotel, a property that was not even the one where he and Jamie were staying, roughly 10 miles away in the municipality of Benito Juarez. His body was positioned in a way that made no immediate sense, his upper half hanging outside the wall of what was described as an employee bathroom window at the property next door, his feet dangling inside, never reaching the floor. Try to imagine for a moment what that image means. A window ordinary in size, the kind meant for airflow or light, not for a grown man's body to pass through. For Elijah Snow to end up positioned there, half in and half out, something had happened that defied a simple, comforting explanation. And yet, within a remarkably short span of time, Mexican authorities announced their conclusion. They said Snow had climbed or fallen into the window himself, perhaps trying to find a bathroom, perhaps intoxicated and disoriented, and became trapped, unable to gain footing, and slowly succumbed to what forensic reports called mechanical asphyxia due to thoracic abdominal compression. Because of the height of the drop below him, officials explained, his feet could not find purchase once his upper body became lodged, and he lost the ability to support himself, ultimately suffocating under his own weight, pinned against the frame. Officials stated there were no signs of violence at the scene, and that available evidence appeared consistent with an accident. For Jamie Snow, and for Elijah's family back in Texas, that explanation did not hold together. It could not. The story asked them to believe that a trained firefighter, a man who had spent a decade navigating emergencies with a clear head, had somehow climbed into a window at a hotel he had never stayed at, 10 miles from where his wife slept, and quietly died there without anyone noticing until morning. It asked them to accept that this had happened without any struggle worth documenting, without any sign that violence had touched him. But when the family later obtained crime scene photographs, through a local attorney hired specifically to press for answers the family did not trust the initial police account to provide, what they saw contradicted the simplicity of an accident. Elijah's father-in-law, Randy Eledge, was one of the first to see those photographs. What he described was disturbing. Elijah's body appeared to be beaten across most of it, with the notable exception of his head and face, almost as though someone had taken deliberate care to avoid marking the parts of him that would be most visible in an open casket, most obvious to a grieving family saying goodbye. Jamie herself later said that back in Texas, once Elijah's body had been returned home, she and her father-in-law conducted their own examination, item by item, inch by inch, in the terrible, intimate way that only people who loved someone can bring themselves to do. They found bruising not just on his abdomen, which was the injury Mexican authorities had initially told her was the only one present, but across his head, his face, his neck, his back, his torso, and his legs. To Jamie, this was not the pattern of a man who had slipped feet first into a window frame. This was, she believed, the pattern left by more than one person, a story written on her husband's body that told of violence rather than misfortune. The family's suspicion crystallized into public accusation within days. They came forward and said plainly that they believed Elijah had been kidnapped and murdered, not the victim of a bizarre accident, but of a robbery or an assault that had gone fatally wrong. They pointed to inconsistencies in what they had been told, to the selective way police allowed Jamie to view only certain photographs when she identified her husband's body in Mexico, and to the sheer improbability of the official account. The FBI became aware of the case and made contact with the family, and a State Department official confirmed the death of an American citizen abroad, though jurisdiction over the actual investigation remained with Mexican authorities. There was another complicating detail that surfaced in the days after Elijah's death, one that added a layer of pain and confusion for those trying to understand what had happened that night. Jamie herself posted in a Facebook group for the resort on the very night her husband went missing, appealing for help finding him, and in that post she mentioned that the two of them had argued earlier in the evening. It is the kind of detail that, in true crime stories, so often gets seized upon and twisted, turned into implication or suspicion aimed at the person left behind. But an argument between a married couple on vacation, especially one that had likely involved a few drinks, is an ordinary and unremarkable thing. It does not explain a body found miles away wedged into a window. It does not explain bruising across a man's back and neck. What it does explain, perhaps, is why Elijah may have gone back toward the bar alone that night rather than returning immediately to the room. A small human moment of friction that would become, in the retelling of a tragedy, one more fragment of a puzzle that never fully assembled itself into a clear picture. What actually happened to Elijah Snow between the moment he turned back toward the bar and the moment his body was found 10 miles away remains, even now, genuinely unresolved. No one has ever been charged in connection with his death. No criminal prosecution followed the initial ruling of accidental death, and Mexican authorities did not reopen the case as a homicide investigation, despite the family's public pleas and the involvement of the FBI. This is, in many true crime cases, the hardest kind of ending for both a family and an audience to accept. Not a courtroom drama with a verdict of guilt, not a confession, not even the grim closure of a body found and a cause definitively settled, but an open wound, an official record that says accident, sitting uneasily alongside a family's conviction that it says nothing of the sort. It was in the civil courts, rather than the criminal ones, that Elijah's family eventually found a form of accountability, though even that took years to arrive. In July of 2022, almost exactly 1 year after his death, Jamie Snow filed a wrongful death lawsuit, not against any individual accused of harming her husband, but against the institutions she believed had created the conditions for his death. The travel agency, Let's Go on Valkyrie, and the companies that owned and operated the Royalton Chic Resort, RCM Hotel, Blue Diamond Hotels and Resorts, and Sunwing Travel Group. The lawsuit did not argue that these companies had murdered Elijah Snow. It argued something narrower but still damning, that they had failed in their basic duties to protect a paying guest, and that their failures had directly contributed to his death, whatever the precise mechanism of that death had been. The lawsuit's claims painted a picture of an industry built around excess with little structural regard for consequence. It alleged that the travel agency had a duty to warn the Snows about known dangers in the region, including a documented pattern of crime affecting tourists in Cancun, and that it had failed to do so despite having superior knowledge of local conditions. It alleged that the resort itself had been negligent in multiple ways, by overserving alcohol to guests without any apparent limit or oversight, by failing to maintain adequate security cameras or security personnel on the property, by failing to ensure basic physical safety measures that might have prevented a guest from wandering into dangerous or inaccessible parts of the property or a neighboring one, by failing to post adequate warnings about where hotel grounds ended and other properties began, and by failing to act with appropriate urgency once it became clear that a guest had gone missing overnight. Jamie and her children sought damages for the loss of a husband and father, for the mental anguish inflicted by his death, and by the process of seeking truth about it, and for the years of companionship and support they would never receive. The case wound through the legal system for nearly 3 years. Central to the eventual trial was a battle of forensic experts, each side marshalling pathologists to interpret the same set of facts and arrive at strikingly different conclusions. A Mexican pathologist, working within the original investigation, had determined that Elijah's death was caused by traumatic asphyxia. Dr. Jeffrey Barnard, a respected pathologist retained by the plaintiffs, reviewed the autopsy findings, the scene photographs, and a translated version of the original Mexican autopsy report, and reached a conclusion consistent with positional asphyxia, agreeing that alcohol had likely played a significant role in what happened. Yet even Barnard, under cross-examination, would not fully rule out the darker possibility the family had championed from the beginning. He testified that while he was comfortable stating the manner of death was either accidental or undetermined, he could not entirely exclude the possibility that Elijah had been placed in that window in an incapacitated state by other people, a haunting admission that kept the door to foul play from ever fully closing, even within the sworn testimony of an expert witness. On the other side, Dr. Satish Chandru, a pathologist hired by the defense, testified that there was no evidentiary basis to support the idea of an undetermined manner of death, and that the bruising found on Elijah's body was fully consistent with the kind of injuries a person might sustain from becoming trapped and struggling against a hard windowsill, rather than injuries inflicted by other hands. In his professional opinion, every piece of evidence in the case pointed toward an accident, tragic and strange in its specifics, but an accident nonetheless. Two courtroom experts, looking at the same photographs of the same man's body, arrived at conclusions that could not have been more different, and it fell to a jury of ordinary Texans to decide which version of events, or which blend of them, they found more credible. In June of 2025, after a 5-day trial in the 17th District Court in Tarrant County, that jury delivered its verdict. They did not find that Elijah Snow had been murdered, and they did not assign responsibility to any individual attacker, because no such person had ever been identified or charged. Instead, they found that negligence, not violence, was the operative cause of his death, and they apportioned that negligence with striking specificity. 65% of the responsibility was assigned to RCM Hotel, the entity directly operating the Royalton Chic, 25% to Blue Diamond Hotels and Resorts, and 10% to Elijah Snow himself, an acknowledgement that his own choices that night, whatever they were, had played some small part in what happened to him. The jury awarded a staggering $31.175 million in damages to Jamie Snow and her children. It was a verdict that, in a financial sense, held the hospitality companies accountable for what a jury of everyday citizens agreed was a catastrophic failure to protect a guest under their care. But money, however substantial, does not answer the question that has haunted this case since the summer morning a groundskeeper found a man's body wedged into a window that was never meant to hold one. It does not tell Jamie Snow, conclusively and beyond doubt, what happened to her husband in the hours between the moment he turned back toward the hotel bar and the moment his life ended. It does not explain, to the satisfaction of a family that spent years fighting for answers, why bruising covered so much of his body while sparing his face, or how a physically capable man ended up so far from where he was staying, trapped in a position that seems, even now, difficult to reconcile with a simple accident. The civil jury's verdict addressed corporate negligence. It did not, and could not, resolve the deeper mystery of intent, of whether other hands were involved in placing Elijah Snow where he was found, a question that remains, to this day, without a definitive answer. Unmistakably true, verified by every account and untouched by the disputes over mechanism and manner, is the human cost at the center of this story. A 35-year-old man who spent his career running into danger to save others died on what was supposed to be a celebration of 10 years of marriage. A wife who fell asleep expecting her husband to return within minutes woke instead to a nightmare that never fully ended, one that forced her to become an advocate, a researcher, and eventually a plaintiff, simply to seek some measure of acknowledgement for what she lost. 2 children grew up without their father, carrying forward a loss shaped as much by unanswered questions as by grief itself. Elijah Snow went to Cancun to mark a decade of love and commitment. He never came home in the way anyone imagined he would, and the truth of his final hours remains locked somewhere between an official ruling of accident, a family's unwavering belief in something worse, and the quiet, terrible fact that some cases, however thoroughly investigated and litigated, never fully give up their secrets. Story 2. On a warm July evening in 2022, in a quiet corner of Gwinnett County, Georgia, a 16-year-old girl walked out of her front door and into a night that would never let her return. Her name was Susanna Morales, and the short, familiar walk she took that evening one she had made dozens of times before without a second thought, would become the last step she ever took as a free and living girl. What happened to her in the hours that followed would take more than 6 months to uncover, and what was eventually revealed would shatter the trust of an entire community, expose the failures of the very people sworn to protect them, and put a badge-wearing predator behind bars for the rest of his life. Susana Morales was born on June 24, 2006, and grew up in Norcross, a suburb tucked just northeast of Atlanta, where the streets were lined with modest apartment complexes and the summer air hung thick and humid over quiet cul-de-sacs. She was the youngest of her mother Maria's daughters, and by every account from the people who loved her, she was a girl bursting with warmth and creativity. She sang. She played piano. She had recently picked up the guitar and the ukulele, teaching herself chord by chord in the evenings, the way curious, restless teenagers do when they sense they are capable of more than the world has shown them yet. She cheered for her school, Meadow Creek High, and dreamed, her mother would later say, of one day becoming a detective, an aspiration that reads now with a terrible, aching irony, given that it would take detectives like Angela Carter more than half a year to find the answers her own family so desperately needed. Her sister, Jasmine Perez, remembers a girl whose laugh filled a room, a girl who loved experimenting with hair dye, green one month, red the next, blonde after that, as if she were trying on different versions of the woman she was becoming. Her mother, Maria Brand, remembers a daughter who called her mommy and dreamed of celebrating her quinceañera with tacos, her favorite food, the kind of small, specific detail that makes grief unbearable in its intimacy. Susana was, by all descriptions, mellow, responsible, and close to her mother. She was not the kind of teenager who snuck out or disappeared without a word. If her plans changed, she called. She texted. She kept her family in the loop, always. That is precisely what makes the events of July 26, 2022, so chilling in hindsight. It was an unremarkable Thursday during summer break. Susana had spent part of the day helping her mother at work, came home around 4 in the afternoon, and by 6 o'clock told her mother she was walking over to a friend's apartment at the Sterling Glen complex. A trip of less than a mile, one she had made countless times before without incident. Nothing about that walk should have been dangerous. Nothing about that evening gave any warning of what was coming. Susana spent about 4 hours with her friend that evening. At around 10 o'clock, she said her goodbyes and began the walk home. At 9:40 p.m., she had texted her mother, letting her know she was heading back and would be there soon. An ordinary message, the kind sent 1,000 times by 1,000 teenagers checking in with their parents. Surveillance cameras and a location tracking app on her phone picked up her movements. Between 10:07 and 10:21 p.m., she was walking steadily in the direction of her house, retracing the same short, familiar route she had walked so many times before. And then, within the space of a few minutes, everything changed. Sometime between 10:21 and 10:26 p.m., her phone suddenly began moving in the opposite direction. Not at walking speed, but at roughly 40 miles an hour, the unmistakable signature of a vehicle. For 5 minutes, the phone tracked along nearby roads, moving with the rhythm of city traffic, following turns, before it went silent. That whoever had taken Susana threw her phone from the window of a moving vehicle at that exact point, extinguishing the last trace of her that the outside world could follow. Moments after it went dark, the tracking app registered one final, chilling signal. A crash alert, the kind generated when a phone detects a sudden, violent jolt. Susana never came home. She never called. She never texted again. Her mother tried and tried to reach her through the night, and by 9 o'clock the next morning, Maria and Jasmine walked into the Gwinnett County Police Department to report her missing. What followed was, by any measure, a catastrophic failure of urgency. Officers told the family that they needed to wait 48 hours before treating the case seriously, informing them that Susana had probably run away. A conclusion offered with no evidence, and one the family insisted, from the very first hour, could not be true. Susana did not fit any profile of a runaway. She had a boyfriend she stayed in close contact with. She had a mother she confided in daily. She had never once given anyone reason to believe she might vanish by choice. But the runaway label stuck, and it did more than wound the family's pride. It stalled the investigation itself. Under that classification, police were precluded from actively investigating her disappearance for the mandated waiting period. And even after that window passed, the case moved with a sluggishness that felt, to the Morales family, like willful indifference. Weeks passed. The family printed flyers. They knocked on doors. They combed the neighborhood themselves, driving to businesses near the Sterling Glen apartments and asking shop owners to check their security cameras. Work that, by any reasonable standard, should have belonged to trained investigators rather than a grieving mother and her surviving daughter. It was that grassroots effort, not the police department's own resources, that produced the first hard evidence. Security footage confirming Susanna had indeed been walking home, moving in the right direction, safe and visible on camera, just minutes before she disappeared entirely. The Morales family brought this footage directly to investigators. Still, for an agonizing stretch of time, official acknowledgement lagged behind the family's own findings. It was not until late August, a full month after Susanna vanished, that Gwinnett County Police issued their first public statement recognizing her disappearance. And even then, the language was maddeningly cautious. Officials said there was no indication that Morales is in any specific danger, and that she was not believed to be held against her will. Susanna's mother has said publicly that she felt her daughter's disappearance was not taken seriously partly because of a language barrier and because the family is Hispanic, a claim that would later ignite public protests and accusations of discrimination against the police department. Local Spanish-language media became one of the family's few reliable allies in those early months, repeatedly pressing the department for updates and helping push the case into wider public view. Still, for month after month, the answers the family needed simply did not come. 1 month became 2. 2 became 6. Susanna's sister Jasmine has described checking her missing sister's social media accounts daily, silently hoping to find some sign of life, some flicker of activity that might mean she was still out there somewhere, safe. Then, in January 2023, nearly 6 months after Susanna vanished, investigators finally reached back out to the family, this time with a request that made Maria's heart sink instantly. They wanted a DNA sample from her and Susanna's dental records. No parent needs to be told what that kind of request usually means. The answer came less than a month later. On the evening of February 6, 2023, a man riding an off-road vehicle through a wooded area near Highway 316, close to Decola, Georgia, more than 20 miles from the Sterling Glen apartments, happened upon a scattering of bones in the underbrush. He called the police. What followed was methodical and grim. Investigators cordoned off the area, recovered additional skeletal remains, and found something else scattered among the leaves. Fingernails still coated in black polish. That detail would prove devastating in its precision. The final photograph ever taken of Susanna Morales, snapped on the day she disappeared, showed her wearing black nail polish. When the medical examiner compared dental records against the ones the family had provided months earlier, and matched DNA against the sample Maria had given, the identification was confirmed. The remains belonged to 16-year-old Susanna Morales. Because of how long she had been exposed to the elements, the state of decomposition made it impossible for examiners to determine an exact cause of death, a fact that would haunt the case all the way through trial, denying the family even the clarity of knowing precisely how their daughter died. No clothing was found anywhere near her remains, leading investigators to the grim conclusion that whoever left her in those woods had left her body unclothed. The break in the case came from an object lying just 30 yards from where Susanna's remains were found, a black Glock 19 pistol. When investigators ran its serial number, it traced back to a 22-year-old Doraville police officer named Miles Bryant. According to Bryant's own report, filed the very morning after Susanna disappeared, the gun, along with his wallet and military identification, had been stolen from his unlocked car parked at the Sterling Glen apartments. That detail alone was enough to raise investigators' suspicions, because Sterling Glen was not just some random address to Bryant. It was where he lived. It was also, notably, the very complex where Susanna had spent her final evening alive. As investigators dug deeper, the coincidences accumulated with unnerving speed. Cell tower data placed both Bryant's personal phone and his police-issued work phone near the exact location where Susanna's body was eventually found, not only on the night she disappeared, but again the following morning. That same morning, Bryant returned to the wooded area a second time, and roughly an hour later, he filed his report claiming the gun had been stolen. His internet search history, when investigators obtained it, contained a query that would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. How long does it take a body to decompose? He had also searched Google Maps repeatedly for the very location where Susanna's remains would eventually be discovered, and conducted what investigators described as extensive searches related to her disappearance and to license plate recognition cameras, as though trying to determine whether he had been caught on film. When detectives brought Brian in for questioning, he denied ever knowing or seeing Susanna Morales, and denied ever having been near where her body was found. But once confronted with the cell tower evidence placing him squarely at the scene, his story shifted. He admitted he had been in the area, but claimed it was because he had been arguing with his girlfriend over text, and had simply driven aimlessly, coincidentally stopping in the very patch of woods where Susanna's remains would be discovered 6 months later. Detective Angela Carter, who led the interrogation, later described watching Bryant grow visibly nervous, shaking, she said, especially once she told him they had recovered his gun. "This poor girl didn't deserve this," Carter said afterward. "I just wanted him to take responsibility and actually tell us what happened. He never did." On February 13th, 2023, Miles Bryant was arrested and charged, initially only with concealing a corpse and filing a false police report. He was fired from the Doraville Police Department almost immediately. But the timing of his arrest carried its own cruel weight. It came on the very day the Morales family had gathered to bury Susanna, finally able to lay her to rest after 6 agonizing months of uncertainty, only to learn within hours that the man responsible for her death was a police officer. "I have no words, honestly," Jasmine said at the time. "We didn't know what to expect, but the officer was probably the least on my mind of theories." What emerged next painted a disturbing portrait of a young man whose warning signs had been visible for years, ignored again and again by institutions that should have intervened. Long before he ever crossed paths with Susanna, Bryant, while still a teenager himself, a student at Buckmar High School, was accused of breaking into a 16-year-old classmate's home and stealing her underwear. The case never reached police because his parents reportedly persuaded the victim's family not to file a report. Months later, he allegedly attempted to break into a second classmate's home, claiming he had only come to review homework, and in 2019 was accused of a third break-in, tampering with a window lock in a Snellville home without stealing anything. None of these incidents led to charges at the time. All of them would resurface publicly only after his arrest for Susanna's murder. Even more damning was the case of Alicia Bates, a woman who had known Bryant since 5th grade. After she rebuffed his attempts to rekindle a relationship as adults, she says he began stalking her, repeatedly showing up at her apartment, jiggling her doorknob, and on at least one occasion, actually breaking her door and entering while she was not home. Her neighbor's doorbell camera captured him clearly enough that she recognized him instantly. Terrified, she bought a gun to protect herself and reported him to both the Gwinnett County Police Department and his own employer, the Doraville Police Department. Doraville's response was to speak with him, after which they claimed the behavior stopped. Gwinnett County, for its part, never even assigned a detective to investigate the complaint until after Susanna's murder made headlines, at which point the department publicly acknowledged that failure and reopened the case. Even within his own department, Bryant had accumulated disciplinary red flags: a 12-hour suspension for being disrespectful toward a fellow officer, and a formal reprimand for waiting 3 days to file a missing persons report that was legally required within 2 hours. None of it stopped his career. A performance review completed shortly before Susanna's murder described Bryant as well-liked among colleagues, someone who could become an exemplary police officer. News of Bryant's arrest, and the pattern of misconduct that followed him, ignited outrage across Gwinnett County's Latino community, which had long felt that cases involving Hispanic victims were treated with less urgency than others. 10 days after Susanna's remains were identified, roughly 50 residents organized under the banner Hispanic United Alliance and staged a protest, demanding accountability and pointing to a pattern they saw reflected in several other cases of missing or murdered young Latino residents in the county. Gwinnett County Police responded with a written statement insisting they serve their community in an unbiased and compassionate manner, while acknowledging in community meetings that the department had initially treated Susanna's case as a runaway situation before shifting their approach. By late February 2023, prosecutors added far more serious charges against Bryant: murder and kidnapping. Nearly a year later, in January 2024, they added a charge of assault, even as they continued to acknowledge they still had no confirmed cause of death. The decomposition of Susanna's remains had erased that particular truth forever. Bryant's trial began in June 2024, presided over by Judge Tamala Adkins. Because Susanna's cause of death could never be scientifically determined, prosecutors built their case around a mosaic of circumstantial evidence and character. Cell phone data placing Bryant at the scene, his damning internet searches, his implausible explanation for his presence there, and a pattern of predatory behavior toward women that lead prosecutor Brandon Delphant argued revealed his true character. In his opening statement, Delphant told the jury bluntly, he used his badge, and he used his position to satisfy his own desires. He is a cop who turned into a killer. The trial revealed testimony from one of Susanna's friends, who described a prior encounter with Bryant at the Sterling Glen Apartments, during which he had offered the underage girls drugs, edibles, alcohol, and a ride to get pizza, an offer they refused because, as her friend put it plainly on the stand, "We're underage, you're grown." A jailhouse informant testified that Bryant, while awaiting trial, had bragged that investigators would never find blood or physical evidence tying him to the crime, and even suggested Susanna might not have been his only victim. Detective Angela Carter, described by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as the prosecution's star witness, recounted her 3-hour interrogation of Bryant and his visible, escalating nervousness once confronted with the evidence of his gun. Bryant's defense argued relentlessly that the prosecution could not prove how Susanna died at all, suggesting an overdose was just as plausible as murder, and insisting that Bryant's suspicious behavior, however disgusting, his decision to leave her body in the woods, did not amount to proof of murder or kidnapping. Bryant himself chose not to testify, and his legal team presented no evidence of their own. On June 12, 2024, after deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping, and filing a false police report. He was acquitted of attempted rape. Before his sentencing, Bryant offered a brief, almost hollow statement. "I just want to apologize to everybody, to the victim's family. That's it." Judge Adkins sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 12 months for the false report conviction. Bryant has continued to fight his conviction. He filed for a new trial almost immediately, arguing years later that his own defense attorney had provided ineffective counsel, a claim his trial judge ultimately rejected in March 2026, prompting him to escalate his appeal to the Supreme Court of Georgia, where it remains pending. Meanwhile, Susanna's family has pursued its own form of justice outside the criminal courts, filing a civil lawsuit against the Sterling Glen apartment complex for hiring and retaining Bryant as a courtesy officer despite what they argue was a documented history of misconduct that should have disqualified him entirely. Susanna Morales was laid to rest at Gwinnett Memorial Park in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Susanna Morales was 16 years old. She wanted to be a detective one day. She never got the chance to grow into that dream, or into any of the others she was only just beginning to explore. The guitar chords she was still learning, the hair colors she had yet to try, the quinceañera she never got to celebrate with tacos and her mother by her side. What remains of her now is a case file, a conviction, and a community forever changed by how long it took anyone in power to simply believe that something terrible had happened to a good girl walking home. Story 3. In the early hours of September 1st, 2017, a phone rang at a 911 dispatch center in Raleigh, North Carolina. The voice on the other end was calm at first, almost dazed, belonging to a 29-year-old man named Matthew Phelps. "I think I killed my wife," he said. "I had a dream, and then I turned on the lights and she's dead on the floor. I have blood all over me, and there's a bloody knife on the bed, and I think I did it. I can't believe this." Within minutes, police cars were racing toward a quiet house on Patuxent Drive, where they would find 29-year-old Lauren Hugelmeyer Phelps lying on the bedroom floor, her body marked by wounds too numerous to count at first glance. What officers discovered that night would ignite a case that captivated the nation, not simply because of its brutality, but because of the strange and unsettling explanation the killer offered for it: cold medicine. Lauren Hugelmeyer was, by every account from the people who loved her, a woman defined by warmth and service to others. She worked as a youth group leader at her church, guiding teenagers through the same uncertainties of faith and growing up that she herself had once faced. She was close to her parents, the kind of daughter who called, who visited, who stayed woven into the fabric of her family's daily life. In late 2016, she married Matthew Phelps, a man who described himself as an aspiring pastor, someone drawn to ministry and, seemingly, to a life of quiet devotion. To outsiders, theirs looked like a young couple building a life together, tied by shared faith and shared plans. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to spread. According to relatives who spoke with investigators after Lauren's death, the marriage of less than a year was buckling under financial strain. Matthew, it turned out, had been spending far more money than the couple actually earned, and Lauren, worried about their mounting debts, had recently taken firm, deliberate steps to limit her husband's access to their finances. Friends told police the couple argued frequently, and the tension in their home on Patuxent Drive had become, in the months before her death, a near-constant undercurrent. Lauren's family later revealed something even more troubling. She had endured what they described as emotional and verbal abuse throughout the marriage, and in the final months of her life, she had grown withdrawn, nervous, unlike herself. Her father would later recall, with the particular ache of hindsight, that the last time he saw her alive she seemed like a mess, anxious, distracted, and he has carried the regret of not asking her what was wrong ever since. What none of them fully understood at the time was that Lauren had quietly reached a breaking point. In the hours before her death, she made phone calls and sent text messages to people close to her, and those messages revealed a woman who had made up her mind. She was tired of the fighting. She believed she was done with the relationship, done with the marriage entirely. She had not yet told her family the full extent of her decision. She may have just told her husband. On the night of August 31st into the early morning of September 1st, 2017, something inside that house on Patuxent Drive turned catastrophic. According to the case her family would later piece together with detectives, Lauren's family came to believe that Matthew had made a decision that night. If Lauren was going to leave him, she was not going to leave him alive. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, Matthew picked up the phone and dialed 911. His voice on that recording carries a strange, almost theatrical disorientation, describing waking from what he called a dream to find his wife dead on the floor beside him, a bloody knife resting on the bed, blood covering his own body. He told the dispatcher he had taken Coricidin cough and cold the night before to help himself sleep, framing what had happened as something that had occurred to him, almost passively, rather than something he had done. When police arrived at the house, they found Lauren on the bedroom floor, and the scene told a story far more violent than a man's hazy, medicine-induced confusion could explain. She was lying on her stomach, and according to investigators who would later describe the scene, her killer had been sitting on her back as he stabbed her, again and again. She was rushed to WakeMed, arriving at around 1:45 in the morning, but there was nothing anyone could do. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. At the same time, police were processing the horror inside that house. Another scene of devastation was unfolding several miles away. Officers went to notify Lauren's parents of what had happened, arriving at their door in the dead of night. The kind of visit every parent dreads and somehow, on some instinctive level, half expects the moment headlights swing into the driveway after midnight. Lauren's mother would later describe that moment with haunting clarity. She turned to the officers before they could even speak and asked, "Did Matt kill her?" When they asked her why she would say such a thing, she had no concrete answer, only a mother's dread. "I don't know," she told them. "I just know." Moments later, the officers confirmed what she already, somehow, knew to be true. The full scope of the violence inflicted on Lauren Hugelmeier would not become public until weeks later, when the state medical examiner's office released its autopsy findings. The report was 11 pages long, and its central, staggering conclusion left little room for the passive, dreamlike narrative Matthew Phelps had offered police. Lauren had been stabbed a total of 123 times. The wounds were catalogued with clinical precision. 44 wounds to her head, 24 to her torso, 17 to her right arm, and 38 to her left arm. The distribution of those wounds told its own story. The extensive damage to her arms suggested she had raised them again and again, trying desperately to shield herself, trying to fight back against an attack that would not stop. Her manner of death was formally ruled a homicide, caused by multiple sharp force injuries. Investigators who examined the scene noted something that struck them as deeply strange given the scale of the violence. Matthew had almost no blood on him, only a few drops on his shoes and feet, far less than anyone would expect from a man who had allegedly just killed his wife in a violent, thrashing struggle. It was as though he had been careful, even in the chaos. From nearly the first moments of the investigation, detectives were skeptical of the explanation Matthew Phelps offered. Cold medicine, even taken in excessive doses, does not typically cause a person to rise from bed, retrieve a kitchen knife, and inflict over 100 wounds on another human being with no memory of having done so. Bayer, the manufacturer of Coricidin, issued a public statement extending sympathy to the family, while firmly noting that there was no evidence linking their product to violent behavior. Investigators were already looking elsewhere for answers, and what they found painted a picture entirely different from the grieving, confused husband Matthew Phelps had presented himself to be in that 911 call. Detectives began combing through Matthew's social media accounts and interviewing people who knew him. What emerged was a portrait of a young man with a fixation that had, apparently, gone unnoticed or unspoken by those around him for some time. Investigators located an Instagram account belonging to Phelps under the username Marty_Radical, and what they found there was chilling in its specificity. The account was populated with scenes and imagery from the film in which a wealthy Wall Street executive who leads a secret double life as a serial killer. It was not simply that Phelps admired the film. Photographs on the account showed him dressed as the character, styled to resemble the very man the film portrays descending into violent obsession. Friends told investigators that Phelps had, at some point, expressed a disturbing curiosity to them, wondering aloud what it might be like to actually kill someone. For a man who described himself as an aspiring pastor, someone meant to guide others toward light and away from darkness, the contrast was almost impossible to reconcile. Investigators laid out this pattern of behavior in the search warrant documents that would later become public, framing it alongside the financial pressures and the marital conflict as pieces of a larger puzzle. A man burdened by debt he could not control, a wife who had begun to take that control away from him, a marriage unraveling toward its end, and beneath it all, a private fascination with violence that had apparently simmered unnoticed for who knows how long. Police did not need to search far for their suspect. Matthew Phelps was the one who had called 911. He was the one found in the house with blood on him and a knife on the bed beside his wife's body. He was taken into custody almost immediately, his behavior at the scene striking officers as suspicious even before the deeper investigation into his background and his online presence had begun. He was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and held without bond at the Wake County Jail, awaiting a legal process that would stretch on for another full year. For Lauren's family, the arrest offered no comfort, only confirmation of the fear that had gripped her mother the instant police appeared at the door that night. They had lost Lauren, and in the same breath, they were forced to confront the reality that the person responsible was the man she had married less than a year earlier, the man who was supposed to have built a life with her, not taken it from her. In the months following Lauren's death, as the case slowly worked its way through the courts, her family began to speak more openly about what they had noticed and what they had missed. They told reporters that in the time leading up to Lauren's murder, they had observed a change in Matthew. He had grown withdrawn, spending less time with the family, sinking into what looked like depression. Their fear at the time had been that he might hurt himself. It never once crossed their minds that he might hurt Lauren. He fooled them all, the family would later say, reflecting on how completely his outward presentation as a devoted husband and man of faith had concealed whatever was building beneath the surface. Lauren's mother, in an interview, described her raw grief with unflinching honesty. "I miss her," she said. "I wish I could hold her." She recounted watching Matthew, changed in appearance with long hair and a full beard by the time of his plea, stand and offer an apology in the courtroom. "I am sorry that I took away Lauren's life," he told her family directly. Asked whether she could ever forgive him, her answer was immediate and unwavering. "No, never. I'll take him to my grave, and I'll still hate him." Turning her thoughts to her daughter, she said simply, "I miss her and I love her. I'm sorry. I let you down. I should have seen it." Lauren's father, too, carried his own private grief and guilt, remembering how nervous and unsettled Lauren had seemed the last time he saw her, and wishing desperately that he had asked her what was wrong before it was too late. As the investigation deepened through late 2017 and into 2018, prosecutors continued to build their case around the digital trail Phelps had left behind, the financial and emotional turmoil inside the marriage, and the simple, undeniable physical evidence. 123 wounds inflicted on a woman who had raised her arms again and again trying to survive. The theory that emerged, and which Lauren's family came to believe completely, was not one of a confused man losing control under the haze of cough medicine, but of a calculated decision made by a husband who had learned his wife intended to leave him and who chose, in that moment, that she would not be allowed to. "He planned the whole thing from the get-go, in my opinion," one family member said, "right from day one to the end." On October 4th, 2018, more than a year after Lauren's death, Matthew Phelps appeared in court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The plea brought the criminal case to a close without the drawn-out spectacle of a full trial, but it offered the family only a narrow measure of closure. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensured he would never again be free, never again pose a threat to another woman who might cross his path. In court, he turned to face Lauren's family directly and offered his apology, the same words he would repeat afterward to reporters. He was sorry that he had taken away Lauren's life. For her mother, no apology could undo what had been done, and no length of prison sentence could return the daughter she had lost. Lauren's family made a deliberate choice to speak publicly, appearing in a nationally broadcast interview to share their story, not for sympathy alone, but as a warning to others. They wanted people to understand that abuse does not always look like bruises or broken bones. Sometimes it looks like emotional and verbal cruelty that slowly isolates a person, that makes them doubt themselves, that convinces them the tension in their home is simply what marriage is supposed to feel like. Lauren's mother reflected with painful honesty that she had never spoken to her children about domestic abuse, and she wished, in hindsight, that she had. Her message to other families was direct. Those experiencing abuse need to find the courage to speak out, but just as importantly, The people around them need to ask the hard questions and take action rather than assume everything is fine. No family should suffer what that family's gone through. The interviewer who spoke with them reflected afterward. Lauren Hugelmeyer was 29 years old when she died. A young woman who spent her time guiding teenagers through their own struggles at her church, who was loved fiercely by her parents, and who had, in her final hours, quietly summoned the courage to decide her marriage was over. She never got the chance to act on that decision. What she left behind was a grieving family determined to turn their devastating loss into a warning for others, and a case that continues to serve as a stark reminder that the people closest to us are not always who they appear to be, and that the quiet signs of trouble in a relationship are worth naming out loud, before it is too late to do anything but grieve. Story 4. The summer of 2022 in Akron, Ohio, was thick with a heat that clung to the skin, a familiar, oppressive humidity that settled over the city's sprawling neighborhoods. It was a city of contrasts, where the quiet, tree-lined streets of suburban life bled into the harder edges of urban struggle, a place where hope and despair often lived side by side. Toni Westover knew both. At 34, she was a woman in the process of building a life, a medical assistant whose days were spent in the service of others, her hands offering a small measure of comfort in a world full of aches and pains. More than anything, she was a mother, her love for her children the unwavering compass that guided her existence. Toni was a woman of vibrant energy, her presence a source of light for her family and friends. Her sister, Amy Perry, would later remember her not just as a sibling, but as a confidant, a partner in the intricate dance of life. But beneath the surface of her bright, capable exterior, Toni, like so many, navigated the complexities of relationships and the quiet anxieties of the everyday. Her life was a tapestry of responsibilities and dreams, a delicate balance of work, motherhood, and the search for personal happiness. She was in a relationship with a man named Brian Fielders, a connection that, on one fateful July night, would lead her down a path into a darkness from which she would never return. The night of July 25th, 2022, began like many others. The suffocating heat of the day had given way to the deep, velvety black of a summer night. The air was alive with the hum of cicadas and the distant rumble of traffic. For reasons that remain shrouded in the ambiguity of personal choice and circumstance, Toni and her boyfriend, Brian, made their way to a house in the Kenmore neighborhood of Akron. It was not a place of quiet suburban repose. It was a house where people gathered, a nexus of intersecting lives, some of them frayed and tangled by past mistakes and present troubles. Inside that house, a small gathering was underway. Among those present was a man named Quentin Nixon. At 31, Nixon was a man whose life had taken him down a different path than Toni's. He was a man familiar with the harder edges of Akron, a man whose past was marked by choices that had drawn the attention of the law. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed a self-assurance that could be seen as either confidence or arrogance, depending on the observer. He was there with others, including a woman named Angel McLean and another named Ashley Broughton McKnight. The atmosphere was likely a mix of casual conversation and the low-level tension that can permeate a room where lives lived on the margins intersect. As the night deepened and the hours crept past midnight, Toni Westover felt a growing sense of unease. The feeling was primal, a cold whisper of intuition that cut through the warm, stagnant air of the house. Something was wrong. Between 1 and 1:30 in the morning, less than an hour before her life would end, she reached for her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen as she sent a text message to a friend, a digital flare sent out into the darkness. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a grim premonition. Something doesn't feel right. Something feels off. It was the last message she would ever send. The feeling she couldn't articulate, the disquiet that had settled in her soul, was about to manifest in the most brutal and final way imaginable. The catalyst for the explosion was, as it so often is, a confluence of small, seemingly insignificant moments, a volatile mixture of personalities, past grievances, and present tensions. An argument erupted. The specific words, the initial spark that ignited the inferno, would later be debated and contested, filtered through the unreliable lens of memory and self-preservation. But the core of the conflict, according to the accounts that would emerge, centered on a sudden, bizarre accusation. In the charged atmosphere of the room, Quentin Nixon, for reasons that would remain a point of fierce contention, began to suspect that Tony Westover was an undercover police officer. The paranoia, whether fueled by substances, past experience, or the tense dynamics of the room, took hold. The accusation was hurled into the space between them, a verbal grenade that shattered the fragile peace. What happened next was a blur of motion and violence, a chaotic ballet of fear and aggression. A gun appeared. It was a weapon that had no place in a casual gathering, a piece of cold steel that instantly and irrevocably raised the stakes. The accounts of who produced it, who held it first, would diverge. The prosecution would later argue that it was Nixon's gun, that he introduced the weapon into the conflict. Nixon, in his own defense, would claim otherwise, that the struggle began when others became aggressive, and the gun became the focal point of a desperate, multi-person brawl for control. In the heart of this chaos were Quentin Nixon and Tony Westover. They became locked in a struggle, their bodies intertwined in a desperate, physical contest. It was a fight for control of the gun, a fight for dominance, a fight for life. The other people in the room became a chorus of panicked voices and frantic movements. Ashley Broughton McKnight would later describe seeing Nixon and Westover wrestling over the weapon. She would hear Nixon's voice, insistent, pleading with another woman in the room, Angel McLean, to de-escalate the situation. But the situation could not be de-escalated. The physics of the struggle, the pressure of hands on steel, the tension of muscles, the surge of adrenaline, had its own inexorable logic. In the midst of the frantic scuffle, a single, deafening crack ripped through the night. The sound was absolute, a full stop to the chaos. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, the echo of the gunshot hanging in the air like a foul odor. Tony Westover collapsed. The bullet had torn through the base of her neck and into her torso, a wound of catastrophic finality. The struggle was over. The life of the 34-year-old mother, the medical assistant, the woman who had felt so profoundly that something was wrong, was extinguished on the floor of a house in Kenmore. Panic erupted. The gunshot was a starting pistol for a race to escape. The gathering scattered into the night, its members driven by a primal instinct to put distance between themselves and the horror that had just unfolded. In the frantic exodus, crucial pieces of the story were lost, and evidence was allegedly disposed of. Ashley Broughton McKnight would later testify that she saw another party to the incident, someone who was never charged, getting rid of ballistics evidence from the scene, a detail that would become a cornerstone of Nixon's later defense. Quentin Nixon fled. He ran from the house, from the body of Tony Westover, from the crime that would now define his life. He disappeared into the labyrinth of the city, becoming a ghost, a name on a police bulletin, a man on the run. The discovery of Tony Westover's body sent a shockwave of grief and horror through her family and the community. The investigation began immediately. The Akron Police Department, piecing together the fragmented accounts of those who had been present, quickly identified their prime suspect. The manhunt for Quentin Nixon was on. For nearly a month, he remained a phantom, eluding the grasp of law enforcement. Tips came in, whispered leads about his whereabouts, but each one led to a dead end. He moved through the city's hidden spaces, relying on a network of acquaintances to stay one step ahead of the law. The hunt came to a dramatic and violent end in late August 2022. Acting on a solid tip, police tracked Nixon to a house in the University Park neighborhood. He was not there to surrender. A SWAT team was called in, their armored vehicles and tactical gear a stark intrusion into the quiet residential street. They surrounded the house, their commands to surrender echoing in the tense air. Nixon had barricaded himself inside, his final act of defiance. The standoff was short-lived. When commands were ignored, the SWAT team deployed chemical agents, flooding the house with gas to force him out. The acrid smoke filled the air, burning the eyes and throat. Finally, from the attic, a space of last resort, the fugitive emerged. Choking and disoriented, Quentin Nixon was taken into custody. The month-long flight was over. His face, irritated and red from the chemical agents, was captured in the harsh glare of police lights. The man accused of killing Tony Westover was now in the hands of the state. The legal process began with a formality that would become the most defining and controversial aspect of the case. Quentin Nixon was charged with 2 counts of murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. He was facing the rest of his life in prison. But when it came time to appoint a lawyer, to provide him with the counsel guaranteed by the Constitution, Nixon made a fateful decision. He would represent himself. He would be his own attorney, a pro-se defendant in a capital murder trial. It was a choice born of a profound distrust of the system he was now caught in, and an unshakable belief in his own ability to prove his innocence. To the court, it was a precarious and ill-advised move. To Nixon, it was the only way. He believed he was the only one who could tell his story, the only one who could expose the conspiracy he was convinced had been orchestrated to pin the murder solely on him. The trial of the state of Ohio versus Quentin Nixon began in the fall of 2024. It was a bench trial, meaning there would be no jury of his peers. The final judgment would rest in the hands of a single person, Judge Christine Croce. From the outset, the courtroom was a theater of the unusual. On one side sat the polished, experienced legal team of the prosecution, led by Felicia Easter. On the other side, at the defendant's table, sat Quentin Nixon, a man in a prison jumpsuit, acting as his own counsel, a standby attorney sitting beside him as a silent, largely unused resource. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. They painted a picture of Nixon as a paranoid, violent man who, in a fit of delusion, accused an innocent woman of being a police informant and then executed her. Their first key witness was Brian Fielders, Tony Westover's boyfriend. He testified about the events of that night, his voice heavy with the weight of the tragedy, his account placing the blame squarely on Nixon. Next came the eyewitnesses who had been in the house. Ronald Crew and Adam Wright took the stand, their testimonies adding layers to the chaotic scene. But the most crucial eyewitness was Ashley Broughton McKnight. In her initial testimony for the state, she described the struggle over the gun, her words painting a damning picture of Nixon as the aggressor who ultimately shot and killed Westover. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Christy Waite, provided the cold, scientific facts. A single gunshot wound was the cause of death, and the manner was homicide. When it was his turn, Quentin Nixon rose to cross-examine the state's witnesses. His performance was a raw and often clumsy display of courtroom procedure, but it was driven by a fierce, singular focus. He was not trying to be a lawyer. He was trying to survive. He repeatedly questioned the detectives, Edward Hornacek and Danny D'Annunzio, about their investigation. Why weren't Brian Fielders and Adam Wright, both men with criminal records who were on parole, charged with violations for being around a firearm? Why had the investigation zeroed in on him so quickly, ignoring evidence that implicated others? "This is not murder," he would state, the phrase becoming a mantra, a plea, and a declaration of war against the narrative being built against him. He accused the investigators of setting their sights on him from the beginning, of ignoring facts that didn't fit their theory. Then came the moment for him to present his own defense. He took the witness stand, no longer the questioner but the storyteller. In a long, detailed account, he laid out his version of that night. It was a story of self-defense, of a situation that had spiraled out of control, a story where he was not the villain, but a victim of circumstance. He described a chaotic brawl, a fight for his life against multiple people, claiming the gun went off accidentally in the midst of the struggle. He was not a monster, he insisted, but a man fighting for his life. The most dramatic moment of the trial, a twist worthy of a legal thriller, came after Nixon's testimony. The trial had taken a month-long break. When it resumed, something remarkable happened. Ashley Broughton McKnight, the prosecution's star eyewitness, had reached out to the prosecutor's office. She had seen Nixon's testimony, and it had stirred something in her conscience. She returned to court, but this time she was recalled to the stand by Nixon as a witness for the defense. Her new testimony sent a shockwave through the courtroom. "I don't think he's lying," she told the court, her voice steady. She walked back a key part of her earlier testimony. She had previously said that Nixon had called Westover a cop. Now she corrected herself. What she had actually heard, she clarified, was Nixon saying, "I'm not a cop," a desperate plea made while he was trying to get Angel McClain to de-escalate the situation. The difference was profound. It changed the entire context of the conflict, shifting Nixon from a paranoid accuser to a man trying to defuse a situation that had turned against him. She also stood by her assertion that she saw another person at the party get rid of ballistics evidence. "He should not be the only one sitting up there," she said, gesturing to Nixon, adding that the entire tragedy could have been prevented if others had intervened. Her testimony cast a long shadow of doubt over the prosecution's neat and tidy narrative. It introduced a powerful element of ambiguity, a credible alternative to the story of a cold-blooded murder. But would it be enough? The trial moved to its conclusion. In her closing argument, prosecutor Felicia Easter dismissed Nixon's story as a web of lies. She pointed to the inconsistencies in his accounts to the police and his testimony in court. His decision to flee, to get rid of the gun, and to barricade himself in a house in a standoff with police were not the actions of an innocent man, she argued. They were textbook evidence of a guilty conscience. Then, Quentin Nixon stood to deliver his own closing argument. He was not a polished orator. He was a man on the brink, his entire future hanging in the balance. He spoke with a raw, unvarnished passion. He lamented that others at the party, who had committed drug and gun offenses while on probation, had walked free while he alone faced a murder charge. He repeated one last time, a man who had been fighting for my life. The verdict came on a cold day in November 2024. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Tony Westover's family sat together, their faces a mask of grief and hope. Quentin Nixon sat at the defendant's table, alone with his thoughts. Judge Christine Croce entered the room and took her seat. Before delivering her verdict, she addressed the defendant directly. Her words were a stern rebuke of his most critical decision. By choosing to represent himself, she said, he had done himself a great and grave disservice, a choice that a more nuanced legal strategy from a trained attorney might have avoided. Then she delivered the verdict. On the charge of murder, guilty. On the second count of murder, guilty. On felonious assault, guilty. On tampering with evidence, guilty. On an unrelated charge of improper handling of a firearm, guilty. As the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, Quentin Nixon's composure finally broke. The self-assured man who had so confidently cross-examined witnesses and argued his own case dissolved into a weeping wreck. He lowered his head, and his body shook with sobs, the raw, unfiltered sound of a man whose world had just ended. At his sentencing, he was given one last chance to speak. He stood and faced the court and the family of the woman he had killed. "I'm not a monster," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He apologized to Tony Westover's mother and sister, asking for their forgiveness. But he held fast to his truth, his final act of defiance against the narrative that had convicted him. It didn't happen the way they said it happened. Judge Croce, in her final remarks, acknowledged that Nixon now seemed remorseful, a different person from the one who had been led down a path of drugs and violence. But she also called his testimony illogical and unsupported by the evidence. The law demanded a price for the life that had been taken. She sentenced Quentin Nixon to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 21 years. The case of Quentin Nixon is a tragedy with many victims. The first and most profound is Tony Westover, a mother whose life was stolen in a moment of senseless violence, leaving behind a family to navigate a world forever dimmed by her absence. But the case is also a complex and unsettling portrait of a man who, convinced of his own innocence, took on the full weight of the legal system himself, only to be crushed by it. Was he a cold-blooded killer who almost talked his way out of a murder charge, or was he a scapegoat, a man unfairly singled out in a chaotic tragedy where blame was diffuse and hard to pin down. The conflicting testimony, the missing evidence, the sheer human messiness of it all, leaves behind a residue of doubt. The law, however, requires certainty, and in the eyes of the law, the case is closed. Quentin Nixon is a murderer. But in the quiet moments, in the space between the official record and the conflicting stories told on the stand, the question of what truly happened on that hot July night in Akron, Ohio, continues to linger, a ghost in the machinery of justice. Story 5. The Central Texas landscape in the summer of 1986 was a study in heat and stillness. The sun beat down with a relentless, oppressive glare, baking the earth and bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy blue. In the quiet, suburban enclave of Williamson County, just north of Austin, life moved to the slow, predictable rhythm of a community that believed in family, faith, and the unshakable certainty of its own moral compass. It was a place of freshly mown lawns, sprawling live oak trees, and a sense of order that felt as solid and as permanent as the Texas soil itself. In this idyllic setting, Michael and Christine Morton had built a life that was the very picture of the American dream. They had met as students at Stephen F. Austin State University, their love story a classic campus romance that had blossomed into a deep and abiding partnership. Michael, a man of quiet strength and steady devotion, and Christine, a woman whose vibrant, joyful spirit seemed to illuminate every room she entered, were a perfect match. They married and settled into a modest home, their lives a happy tapestry woven from the simple, profound threads of work, love, and the hopeful beginnings of a family. Their world was completed by the arrival of their son, Eric, a bright, curious 3-year-old whose laughter was the soundtrack of their lives. Michael managed a sporting goods store, a job that provided a comfortable, if not extravagant, living. Christine dedicated herself to being a mother, her days a whirlwind of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the all-consuming, fierce love that only a mother can know. They were happy, their future a landscape of limitless, sun-drenched possibility. The morning of August 13th, 1986, began like any other. It was Michael's 32nd birthday. He rose early, the house still cloaked in the cool, pre-dawn shadows. Christine had left a note for him on the bathroom mirror, a simple, loving birthday message. He found another note on the kitchen table, this one a more practical reminder of the small, domestic details of their shared life, accompanied by a gift, a final, tender gesture of her affection. He left for work before Christine and Eric were fully awake, his mind already on the demands of the day, his heart secure in the quiet, comforting certainty of the life he would return to that evening. He did not know, could not have known, that he was leaving his home and the life he knew for the very last time. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came late that afternoon. A neighbor, concerned that Christine had not picked up Eric from daycare as planned, went to the Mortons' home to check on her. The house was quiet still. The neighbor peered through a window and saw a sight that would forever be seared into her memory: a child's footprints tracked in blood across the floor. When the police arrived, they entered a scene of brutal, unimaginable violence. The master bedroom, a sanctuary of intimacy and rest, had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. Christine Morton, just 31 years old, was lying on the bed, her body battered and bludgeoned to death. An overflowing laundry basket had been placed over her, and a suitcase had been piled on top of that, a bizarre and grotesque attempt to conceal the horror. The weapon, a blunt object, had been used with a savage, unrestrained fury. The room was a chaotic canvas of blood and overturned furniture, a testament to the life-or-death struggle that had taken place. And in the midst of this carnage, a small, blue bandana was found near the bed, a seemingly insignificant piece of fabric that held the silent, microscopic secret of the killer's identity. The news shattered Michael's world. He rushed home from work, his mind unable to process the nightmarish reality of what he was being told. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, was gone, stolen from him in an act of violence so profound it defied comprehension. His grief was a raw, physical agony, a pain so immense it threatened to consume him. But in the cold, dispassionate world of a homicide investigation, grief is often viewed through a lens of suspicion. And in the eyes of the Williamson County Sheriff's Department, led by the formidable and politically ambitious Sheriff Jim Boutwell, there was only one suspect, the husband. The theory that formed in the minds of the investigators was a simple, classic one, a story as old as crime itself. It was a case of marital discord, a birthday argument that had escalated into a murderous rage. They latched onto the idea that Michael, in a fit of anger over Christine's refusal to have sex with him on his birthday, had beaten her to death. To support this theory, they began to construct a narrative, to selectively gather and interpret evidence that fit their preconceived conclusion, while ignoring or suppressing anything that did not. They pointed to Michael's seemingly calm demeanor in the hours after the murder, interpreting his shock and numbness as the cold detachment of a killer. They seized upon the birthday note Christine had left, twisting its mundane, domestic contents into a sign of a troubled marriage. They ignored the fact that there was no physical evidence linking Michael to the crime scene, no blood on his clothes, no scratches or bruises on his body that would indicate a violent struggle. They had their story, and they were sticking to it. Michael, lost in a fog of grief, was bewildered by the direction the investigation was taking. He was the victim, the grieving husband, the man whose life had been destroyed. How could they possibly think he was the killer? He cooperated fully, answering their questions, trying to help them find the monster who had done this. He told them about the blue bandana, suggesting it might have been left by the killer. He told them about a suspicious green van he had seen parked near his home on several occasions, a detail he thought might be a valuable lead. And he recounted a strange and disturbing detail from his son, Eric. The little boy, the only witness to his mother's murder, had told his grandmother that a monster had hurt his mommy. He said the monster was scary, and that he was not Daddy. He even described hiding under the bed as the monster attacked his mother. It was the desperate, fragmented testimony of a terrified child, but it was also a powerful, exonerating piece of information. The killer was not his father, but the investigators were not interested in a monster in a green van. They were interested in Michael Morton. They dismissed Eric's statements as the unreliable ramblings of a traumatized child. They ignored the lead about the green van. And most crucially, they suppressed the evidence that would have proven Michael's innocence from the very beginning. Christine's mother, who lived out of state, had told the investigators that Eric had described the attack to her in detail. He had watched it happen. This information, this direct, eyewitness account from the only person who had seen the killer, was never turned over to Michael's defense attorneys. The bandana, which could have been tested for DNA, was filed away, its secrets locked in an evidence locker. And the information about the green van was buried in a file, forgotten. The Williamson County District Attorney, Ken Anderson, a man with a reputation for being tough on crime and an eye on a future judgeship, embraced the police's theory with a prosecutor's zeal. He saw a clear path to a high-profile conviction, a victory that would burnish his reputation and advance his career. The truth, it seemed, was a secondary consideration. The arrest of Michael Morton was a foregone conclusion. In February 1987, Michael Morton was put on trial for the murder of his wife. The prosecution, led by Ken Anderson, presented a case built on a foundation of speculation, innuendo, and the deliberate withholding of exculpatory evidence. They had no murder weapon, no physical evidence, and no confession. What they had was a story. They painted a picture of Michael as a cold, sexually frustrated man who had flown into a rage and bludgeoned his wife to death. The medical examiner, in a piece of testimony that would later be proven to be scientifically baseless, claimed that Christine's time of death was in the early morning hours, a time when Michael would have still been at home, a crucial piece of the prosecution's timeline. Michael's defense attorneys fought back, but they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. They did not know about the suppressed police reports. They did not know that the lead investigator, Sergeant Don Wood, believed Michael was innocent and had documented evidence pointing to a third-party killer. They did not know that Eric had told his grandmother he had watched his mother's murder. They were in the dark, and in that darkness their client was condemned. The jury, presented with a one-sided, carefully curated version of the facts, found Michael Morton guilty. The verdict was a devastating, incomprehensible blow. The man who had lost his wife was now losing his freedom, his name, his very identity. He was sentenced to life in prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, his world had been reduced to the four cold walls of a prison cell, his future a bleak, unending landscape of injustice. His son, Eric, was sent to live with Christine's sister, his name changed, his connection to his father severed. Michael Morton had lost everything. For the next quarter of a century, Michael Morton lived in the brutal, dehumanizing world of the Texas prison system. He was no longer a husband, a father, a store manager. He was inmate. He was surrounded by murderers, rapists, and thieves. A man of quiet intelligence and gentle spirit forced to navigate a world of violence and despair. But through it all, he held on to one thing with a fierce, unshakable tenacity: his innocence. He never wavered, never doubted, never gave up hope that one day the truth would come out. He spent his days in the prison library, studying the law, poring over legal texts, becoming an expert in the arcane language of appeals and post-conviction relief. He filed motion after motion, his handwritten petitions a testament to his unending fight for justice. Each one was denied. The system that had so profoundly failed him was now a monolithic, impenetrable wall. He wrote letters to his son, letters that were never delivered, his words of love and longing lost in the void. He was a ghost, a forgotten man, his life a slow, agonizing testament to a catastrophic failure of justice. But outside the prison walls, a small group of people still believed in him. His parents never lost faith, their love a constant, unwavering anchor in the storm of his life. And in the late 1990s, a new hope emerged. The Innocence Project, a non-profit legal organization dedicated to exonerating the wrongfully convicted through DNA testing, took an interest in his case. Their involvement would mark the beginning of a long, arduous legal battle that would eventually tear down the walls of deception that had been built around his case. The fight was led by a team of dedicated, relentless attorneys, including John Raley, a Houston-based civil lawyer who took on Michael's case pro bono, and Nina Morrison of the Innocence Project. Their primary goal was simple: to get the blue bandana, the piece of evidence that had been found at the crime scene 20 years earlier, tested for DNA. It seemed like a straightforward request. The technology now existed to definitively prove whether Michael's DNA, or someone else's, was on that bandana. But they were met with a wall of resistance. The Williamson County District Attorney's Office, now led by John Bradley, a man who had been appointed to the position by the same governor who had appointed Ken Anderson to a judgeship, fought them at every turn. For years, Bradley refused to release the evidence for testing. He argued that it was unnecessary, that Michael's guilt was beyond question, that the jury had spoken. He seemed determined to protect the original conviction at all costs, to preserve the reputation of the office and the men who had come before him, regardless of the truth. He even went so far as to suggest that Michael, in a cunning, premeditated act, had worn the bandana as a mask, committed the murder, and then deliberately left it at the scene to frame an unknown assailant. The argument was as absurd as it was cruel. The legal battle raged for 6 years. Raley and Morrison filed motion after motion, their fight a testament to their unwavering belief in their client's innocence. Finally, in 2011, after a court of appeals ordered him to do so, John Bradley was forced to release the evidence. The bandana was sent to a lab for testing. The results came back, and they were a bombshell. The bandana contained the DNA of 2 people. One was Christine Morton. The other was an unknown male. It was not Michael Morton. This was the moment of vindication, the scientific proof of what Michael had been screaming into the void for 25 years. But the story was not over. The unknown male DNA profile was run through the National DNA Database, CODIS, and it got a hit. The DNA on the bandana belonged to a man named Mark Allen Norwood, a convicted felon with a long and violent criminal history. At the time of Christine's murder, he had been a construction worker living in Austin, just a few miles from the Mortons' home. He had a history of burglary and violence. He was the monster. The discovery of Norwood's DNA was not just an exoneration. It was a revelation of a second, hidden tragedy. In 1988, just 2 years after Christine's murder, another young mother, Deborah Masters Baker, was bludgeoned to death in her home in Austin. The crime was chillingly similar to Christine's murder. The case had gone unsolved for over 2 decades. Investigators, now armed with Norwood's DNA profile, went back and tested the evidence from the Baker murder scene. They found his DNA there as well. The monster who had killed Christine Morton had struck again, his second victim a tragic consequence of a justice system that had locked up the wrong man. On October 4th, 2011, Michael Morton walked out of a Williamson County courthouse a free man. After 25 years in prison, after a quarter of a century of proclaiming his innocence to a world that would not listen, he was finally, officially exonerated. The years had etched themselves on his face, his dark hair now streaked with gray, but his spirit, though battered, was not broken. His first act as a free man was to visit his wife's grave, to finally be able to grieve her loss without the stain of a false accusation. The exoneration of Michael Morton sent a seismic shockwave through the Texas justice system. It was not just a case of mistaken identity. It was a case of deliberate, willful misconduct by the very people who had sworn to uphold the law. The focus now turned to Ken Anderson, the prosecutor who had built his career on Michael's conviction, and Jim Boutwell, the sheriff who had overseen the investigation. An unprecedented court of inquiry was convened to investigate their actions. The evidence was damning. The suppressed police reports, the notes about Eric's eyewitness account, the information about the green van, all of it came to light, a clear and undeniable pattern of prosecutorial misconduct. Ken Anderson, now a sitting district judge, was forced to resign from the bench. He was charged with contempt of court and criminal tampering with evidence. In a stunning and historic moment of accountability, he was sentenced to 10 days in jail, fined and disbarred. He became the first prosecutor in the history of the United States to be jailed for withholding evidence. Sheriff Boutwell had died before he could be held accountable. The culture of conviction at all costs that had defined Williamson County justice for so long had finally been brought into the light. Michael Morton's story became a symbol of the profound and devastating consequences of wrongful convictions. He dedicated his life to advocating for criminal justice reform, his voice a powerful, eloquent testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The Texas legislature passed the Michael Morton Act, a landmark piece of legislation that requires prosecutors to maintain an open file policy, turning over all evidence to the defense, whether it is favorable to their case or not. Mark Allen Norwood, the man whose DNA had finally brought the truth to light, was convicted of the murders of both Christine Morton and Deborah Masters Baker. He was sentenced to life in prison, the true monster finally caged. The case of Michael Morton is more than a true crime story. It is a profound and deeply moving human drama about loss, injustice, and the unshakable power of hope. It is the story of a man who was robbed of his wife, his son, and a quarter-century of his life by a system that was more interested in a conviction than in the truth. And it is the story of his incredible 25-year fight to reclaim his name, his freedom, and his life. In the end, Michael Morton's story is not just about the darkness of a crime, but about the enduring, inextinguishable light of a single, powerful truth. He was, and always had been, an innocent man. Story 6. The biting chill of a North Carolina December night clung to the air, a stark contrast to the fading warmth of the Christmas party they had just left. It was December 17th, 2000, and for Air Force Captain Frank Marty, the and his wife, Dr. Michelle there, the evening should have been winding down into a comfortable, festive haze. They were high school sweethearts, a couple who had navigated the transient life of the military since Marty's graduation from the Air Force Academy in 1991. To their colleagues at the holiday gathering, They had seemed at ease, even holding hands, a small gesture that was noted, a public sign of affection from a couple known to be navigating marital turbulence. But the night was not over. As they drove home, Michelle suddenly remembered something. She had left important documents at her office, she explained, urging Marty to turn the car around. It was a small detour, a seemingly insignificant change of course in the map of their evening, but one that would lead to a destination of unimaginable darkness. Her office was located in a quiet building on Rayford Road in Fayetteville, home to Harbin and Associates, the clinical psychology practice where she worked. The building was dark and deserted, the holiday cheer a distant memory. Marty, a C-130 pilot based at the nearby Pope Air Force Base, waited outside as Michelle went up the stairs to retrieve her papers. The silence of the night was then violently shattered. A series of gunshots echoed through the empty stairwell. Minutes later, the door to the video hut across the street burst open. A frantic woman, her sweater and hands stained with blood, screamed that her husband had just been murdered. The video store employees, Chandra Fusey and Joyce Smith, looked at the distraught woman, Michelle Lear, and noticed something odd. She was agitated and loud, but there were no tears, no shaking, a strange composure for someone who had just witnessed a horrific crime. After they dialed 911, Michelle ran back across the street into the darkness, wanting to be by her husband's side. When police officers arrived, they found a scene of grim intimacy. Michelle was kneeling in the parking lot, cradling Marty's bloodied head in her arms, whispering assurances that everything would be all right. But it was too late. Marty there, shot 5 times, died right there in the cold asphalt lot, his wife's words the last he would ever hear. The initial assessment by investigators quickly ruled out a simple robbery. Marty's wallet and car were untouched. The crime scene told a more calculated, brutal story. It appeared Marty had been on the stairs leading up to Michelle's office when he was shot in both shoulders and both legs, incapacitating him and causing him to tumble down the steps. Then, the killer had delivered a final, fatal shot to the head at point-blank range. When paramedics assessed Michelle at the scene, they made another curious observation. Her pulse was completely normal. She was not in a state of shock. In her initial statement to Sergeant Ralph Clinkscales, Michelle recounted her version of events. She'd gone into the office, heard the shots, and ran outside to find Marty. She claimed she had accidentally locked her keys inside the office in her panic, which was why she had to run across the street to the video store to call for help. Her story was plausible, but the pieces didn't quite fit together in the minds of the investigators. The absence of a clear motive like robbery, combined with Michelle's unnervingly calm physiological state, cast a shadow of suspicion over the grieving widow. That shadow deepened when they learned of a $500,000 life insurance policy for which Michelle was the sole beneficiary. The investigation soon uncovered a name that would unravel the Lear's carefully constructed facade, John Diamond. Acquaintances mentioned him, and phone records confirmed that Michelle had placed a call to him just before she and Marty left the Christmas party. Army Staff Sergeant John Diamond was a sniper, a man trained in the art of killing. He was also Michelle Lear's lover. The case was no longer a random act of violence. It was a tangled web of infidelity, betrayal, and murder. Outwardly, Marty and Michelle Lear were a picture of success. He was a respected Air Force captain, and she was an ambitious psychologist with a doctorate, the first in her family to earn a college degree. But beneath the surface, their marriage was a study in opposites. Marty was a homebody, content with a quiet life, while Michelle was outgoing and craved a more vibrant social scene. They had even sought marriage counseling to bridge the growing chasm between them. Michelle Catherine Forcier was born into a military family, moving frequently throughout her childhood. The constant upheaval and her parents' eventual divorce left a young Michelle with a heavy burden of responsibility, caring for her 2 younger siblings while her mother worked full-time. She was intelligent and driven, but also possessed a fascination with the darker aspects of human psychology, volunteering at a rape crisis hotline and treating violent offenders in prison. This professional interest in the deviant mind would later seem like a chilling premonition. Her secret life blossomed in the anonymity of the internet. In online chat rooms, she could be anyone she wanted to be. It was there that she met John Diamond, a 28-year-old Special Forces soldier stationed at Fort Bragg. He was also married, but like Michelle, he was seeking something more. Their online connection quickly escalated into a face-to-face meeting, and the spark was immediate and intense. They embarked on a stormy affair, reportedly attending swinger parties where they swapped partners for one-night stands. The relationship was all-consuming, particularly for Diamond. He became obsessed, and Michelle, with her psychologist's understanding of human behavior, seemed to know exactly how to pull his strings. By June 2000, just 6 months before the murder, Michelle moved out of her marital home and rented an apartment with Diamond for 3 months. Though Marty eventually persuaded her to return and to try counseling, her affair with Diamond continued. They took a trip to the Caribbean island of Saba in October, where Michelle was exploring a job opportunity. She introduced Diamond as her fiancé to university dignitaries. The trip took a strange turn when they had dinner with a university administrator who casually mentioned he was a former prosecutor in the United States. Michelle and John fled the island abruptly, never contacting the university again. Back in North Carolina, the relationship between Michelle and Diamond grew more volatile and manipulative. Investigators would later uncover 88,000 emails and instant messages between the two, a digital chronicle of their affair and the psychological games Michelle played. She would break up with him in a brusque email, only to draw him back in when his desperation and threats of self-harm reached a fever pitch. This pattern of behavior, known as intermittent reinforcement, created a powerful bond of love obsession or limerence, turning Diamond into a devoted servant, willing to do anything to prove his love. The final, terrible proof of that devotion, prosecutors would argue, was the murder of Marty Thayer. With the discovery of the affair, John Diamond became the prime suspect. His wife, Lourdes, initially provided him with an alibi, claiming they were home watching a movie on the night of the murder. However, she later recanted her statement, telling investigators that Diamond had received a phone call, left the house, and returned late, immediately washing the clothes he had been wearing, an act she and her mother found strange. Further investigation revealed that Diamond had borrowed a 9mm Smith & Wesson handgun from a colleague just days before the murder, a weapon that matched the caliber of the bullets recovered from Marty's body. When the colleague asked for the gun back, Diamond claimed it had been stolen from his car. He even filed a police report to support his story, but surveillance tapes showed his car parked safely in front of Michelle's house on the night of the alleged break-in. The theft had been staged. The evidence against Diamond was mounting. In March 2001, he faced a court-martial. The military could prosecute him not only for murder, but also for adultery. When Michelle Thayer was called to the stand, she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer questions. Despite the circumstantial nature of the case, no eyewitnesses or forensic evidence placed Diamond at the scene. The military jury was convinced. They deliberated for just over 3 hours before finding him guilty. In August 2001, John Diamond was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His sister, Deborah Dvorak, maintained his innocence, telling the media that her brother was a good man who had simply become entangled with the wrong woman. Even with Diamond behind bars, investigators believed he hadn't acted alone. They were convinced Michelle had masterminded the plot. But before civilian law enforcement could bring charges against her, she vanished. Michelle had been living with her grandmother in New Orleans to decompress after the trial. But she wasn't just resting, she was planning her escape. On her laptop, investigators found a typed plan of action. Buy a new computer, get a new burner phone under an alias, print a fake birth certificate, acquire a fake ID, and eventually a new passport. The night before police were scheduled to arrive at her grandmother's house, she fled, packing only clothes and 3 books. How to Disappear in America, Reborn in the U.S. of A. and Secrets of Getting a New Identity. She drove without stopping to the sunny shores of Lauderdale-by-the-Sea, Florida. There, she adopted a new identity, first going by Lexi Solomon, then renting a beach apartment under the theatrical alias Liza Pendragon. She cut her long dark hair and bleached it blonde, but a new hairstyle wasn't enough to guarantee her anonymity. Believing plastic surgery was the key to long-term evasion, she invested in a new nose, a new chin, lip fillers, and an eye lift. When U.S. Marshals finally caught up with her, she still had the faint laser burns on her face from the recent procedures. During her time as a fugitive, she had a new partner, a man named Dana Horton, who investigators later described as seeming brainwashed, as if caught in the same love trance that had ensnared John Diamond. The manhunt for Michelle there lasted for months. The break in the case came from a tapped phone call. Horton called Michelle's father to give him instructions about a storage unit she had rented in New Orleans before disappearing. Law enforcement traced the call to Lauderdale-by-the-Sea. On August 15, 2002, more than a year and a half after her husband's murder, Michelle Lear was arrested on a federal fugitive warrant. Her life on the run was over. Even after her capture, Michelle's manipulative nature was on full display. The prosecutor offered her a plea deal, a full confession in exchange for an 8-year sentence. She refused, perhaps confident that she could charm a jury, just as she had charmed so many men before. The case finally went to trial in 2004. The prosecution's case was built on a mountain of circumstantial evidence, including the 88,000 emails and instant messages that laid bare her affair and her cold, calculating manipulation of John Diamond. During the trial, even her own defense attorney seemed to fall under her spell. In a bizarre and emotional closing argument, he broke down in tears, telling the jury, "She is an incredible woman. She is wonderful. And no," he wept, "I am not entranced by her, am not being manipulated by her." The jury, however, was not so easily swayed. They had heard allegations that Michelle had engaged in affairs with her attorney, a fellow inmate, and a corrections officer while awaiting trial. After deliberating for only a few hours on December 3, 2004, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Michelle Lear was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Life behind bars did little to diminish Michelle's defiant and manipulative spirit. A prison guard referred to her as a high-maintenance inmate, stating that her influence led to a tripling of written complaints and demands from other prisoners. She maintained her innocence, and for a time, her mother and sister ran a website that proclaimed her wrongful conviction and criticized the prison system and the prosecution. The website went offline in 2012. In 2010, her rebellious nature took a more serious turn. Prison staff intercepted mail that led them to believe she was planning an escape. The item in question was a hand-drawn map of the prison that she was trying to mail to a young man who was reportedly infatuated with her. She was placed in disciplinary segregation for 45 days, but she never managed to physically attempt an escape. Over the years, she filed numerous appeals, claiming her constitutional rights had been violated, but all have been denied. John Diamond, serving his life sentence at a military prison in Fort Leavenworth, also made headlines from behind bars. After his conviction, his attorney submitted a proffer, stating Diamond was now willing to testify against Michelle in exchange for a reduced sentence. In his new version of the story, Michelle had told him Marty had raped and abused her and asked him for a gun for protection. He claimed he gave her the gun, met her at the office that night, but that she was the one who shot Marty, and he only helped cover it up. The prosecutor rejected the deal. In 2010, he filed a federal lawsuit seeking $1 million in damages, alleging that the military prison was violating his First Amendment rights by censoring explicit letters to his wife, Lourdes, who continued to stand by him. The case was dismissed. The murder of Captain Marty there was a case that took years to resolve, a complex investigation that required the cooperation of local police, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, OSI, and the U.S. Marshals Service. It was a journey into a sordid world of sex, lies, and manipulation, forcing agents to sift through a digital mountain of he said, she said evidence to uncover the truth. In the end, 2 people were held accountable for the death of a man who, by all accounts, was a dedicated officer and a trusting husband. The case of Michelle there remains a chilling story of betrayal, a testament to the dark capabilities of the human heart, and a cautionary tale of a tangled web woven with such intricate deceit that it ultimately ensnared the weaver herself. Story 7. The winter of 1957 was settling over Sycamore, Illinois, a small, quintessential Midwestern town where the grid of quiet streets and modest homes felt like a fortress against the anxieties of the wider world. Life in Sycamore was measured by the seasons, the church bells, and the predictable rhythm of factory shifts. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, children played freely in the streets until dusk, and the idea of a locked door was almost an affront to the communal trust. In this peaceful pocket of America, Michael and Frances Ridolph were raising their 4 children. Michael worked at a local factory, one of the town's few industrial hubs amidst the sprawling farmlands, while Frances managed the home. Their youngest, Maria Elizabeth Ridolph, was a bright spark in the family. Born on March 12, 1950, she was a 7-year-old with lively brown eyes and a mind that had already earned her a place as an honor student in her 2nd grade class. She was diligent, with perfect attendance at Sunday school, but also, as her mother would later recall with a heart full of sorrow, a nervous girl, prone to hysterics when frightened. She was afraid of the dark and possessed a fierce, piercing scream, a detail her mother believed was a fragile shield. Someone would probably have to kill her to keep her quiet, Frances would say, the words a chilling prophecy she could not have understood at the time. On the evening of December 3, 1957, the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a slate-gray sky, blanketing Sycamore in a soft, ethereal glow. For Maria and her best friend, 8-year-old Kathy Sigmund, the snow was an invitation. After dinner, Maria begged to be allowed outside. The girls, bundled against the cold, ran out into the twilight, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. They lived on the same street, and their world was a small, safe loop between their 2 houses. Their favorite game on evenings like this was one they called Duck the Cars, a simple, thrilling chase where they would dart back and forth across the street, trying to stay out of the beams of approaching headlights. They were playing near the corner of Center Cross Street and Archie Place, lost in their game, when a figure emerged from the gathering darkness. He was a young man, a stranger. Kathy would later describe him to the police. Tall and slender, with light hair, a distinctive gap between his front teeth, and a colorful sweater. He approached them with an easy smile, telling them his name was Johnny. He said he was 24 and not married. He asked them about dolls and if they liked piggyback rides. The questions were innocent enough, the kind a friendly older boy might ask. Maria, trusting and excited by the attention, accepted his offer of a piggyback ride. Johnny carried her up the street and back, her small frame perched on his shoulders. The world, for a moment, must have seemed magical from that height. After the ride, Maria, eager to share her world with this new friend, dashed back to her house, just a few doors down, to retrieve her favorite doll. She returned moments later, clutching the doll, her breath clouding in the cold air. While Maria was showing her doll to Johnny, Kathy realized her hands were getting cold and announced she was running home to get her mittens. She left Maria and the man standing together under the soft glow of the streetlight. It was a fleeting moment, a decision born of childish impulse, but it was a moment that would sever the timeline of Jejic lives, sending them down 2 tragically different paths. When Kathy returned, mittens on her hands, the corner was empty. Maria and Johnny were gone. Kathy's first thought was that they had gone to Maria's house. She ran to the Ridolphas and asked Maria's 11-year-old brother, Charles, if his sister was home. He said no and, at Kathy's urging, went outside to look for her. But there was no sign of Maria. The familiar street was quiet, the falling snow quickly covering any tracks they might have left. The initial belief that Maria was simply hiding, playing a game, quickly evaporated replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The Riddle family's calls for Maria went unanswered. Within the hour, the Sycamore police were called, and the small town's bubble of security was punctured. The news spread through Sycamore like a contagion of fear. What began as a family search quickly swelled into a town-wide manhunt. Police officers and armed civilians fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the snowy darkness, their voices calling Maria's name into the wind. But the night yielded nothing. The man named Johnny, who had appeared as if from nowhere, had vanished with the little girl as completely as if they were apparitions. Within 2 days, the gravity of the situation brought the Federal Bureau of Investigation to Sycamore. The possibility that Maria had been taken across state lines made it a federal case. FBI agents, in their dark suits and serious expressions, became a common sight on the streets, a stark contrast to the familiar faces of the local police. They interviewed the Riddle family, the Sigmunds, and anyone who might have seen the girls that evening. They meticulously reconstructed the timeline. Maria and Kathy had been seen playing alone between 6 o'clock and 6:30 p.m. based on Kathy's account of getting her doll, and then her mittens. The FBI concluded that Johnny must have approached the girls after 6:30, and that Maria was abducted sometime between 6:45 and 7 p.m. By the time Catherine Tessier, a local girl who was not related to the later suspect, returned home from a party at 7 p.m., the search was already underway. Kathy Sigmund was now the most important person in the investigation, the only one who had seen the face of the kidnapper. Fearing for her safety, the authorities placed her in protective custody. She was a child burdened with an adult responsibility, her young mind holding the key to the mystery. For months, she was shown countless photographs of known criminals and suspects, their faces a grim parade of possibilities. Investigators from as far as Madison, Wisconsin, brought her in to view lineups of men, hoping for a flicker of recognition. In late December 1957, at the Dane County Sheriff's Office, she pointed to a man named Thomas Joseph Rivard. But Rivard had an ironclad alibi. He was in jail at the time of Maria's abduction. He was merely a filler in the lineup. Decades later, Kathy would have no memory of identifying him. The list of potential suspects was long and varied. It included transients, known sex offenders, and even a local man who had a reputation for giving children piggyback rides. Among the names on the initial list was a young man who lived just around the corner from the Rydolphs, less than 2 blocks away. His name was John Tessier. At 18, he was known in the neighborhood. His stepfather, Ralph Tessier, was a sign painter who was friendly with the police chief, and even painted the insignia on the doors of the Sycamore police cars. John, born John Cherry in Northern Ireland, had come to Sycamore as a boy after his mother, Eileen, a war widow, married Ralph. He had a rebellious streak, having been expelled from high school for disrespecting a teacher. At the time of Maria's disappearance, he was living at home, waiting to join the U.S. Air Force. The FBI investigated John Tessier early on. The tip that led them to him is a point of contention. Some sources say it came from a local resident, while others suggest his own parents, realizing his name and description were similar to the Johnny being sought, contacted the authorities to clear his name. Whatever the trigger, John and his parents presented investigators with what appeared to be an unshakable alibi. On December 3rd, the day Maria vanished, John Tessier was in Rockford, Illinois, approximately 40 miles away, preparing to enlist. He had been in Chicago the day before for physical exams, and had spent December 3rd sightseeing in the city before taking a train to Rockford, arriving around 6:45 p.m. Upon arrival, he said he made a collect call to his parents in Sycamore to ask for a ride home. Crucially, this alibi was backed by evidence. Phone company records confirmed that a collect call was placed from a payphone in the Rockford post office to the Tessier home at 6:57 p.m. The operator had written down the caller's name as John Tessier. Furthermore, Air Force recruiting officers confirmed that they met with Tessier in Rockford around 7:15 p.m. to handle enlistment paperwork. To solidify his innocence, Tessier passed a lie detector test. On December 10th, 1957, the FBI officially closed their investigation into him, noting he was no longer a suspect. Kathy Sigmund was never shown his photograph. The next day, John Tessier left Sycamore for basic training, and the investigation moved on. The search for Maria Ridulph became a national story. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover took a personal interest in the case. Maria's parents made heart-wrenching appeals on television, their faces etched with a grief that was becoming agonizingly permanent. The winter thawed into a bleak spring, and hope dwindled with each passing day. On April 26, 1958, nearly 5 months after Maria had vanished, 2 tourists were foraging for mushrooms in a wooded area near the small town of Woodbine, about 90 miles from Sycamore. There, under a partially fallen tree, they made a grim discovery: the skeletal remains of a small child. The body was clad only in a shirt, an undershirt, and socks. The state of decomposition indicated the body had been there for months. Dental records, a lock of hair, and the clothing confirmed the worst fears of the Ridulph family and the entire town of Sycamore. It was Maria. The rest of her clothes were never found. The coroner, worried about the sensationalism of the press, made a decision that would have long-term consequences. No photographs were taken of the crime scene. The initial autopsy, hindered by the advanced decomposition, could not determine a cause of death. The case was now officially a murder, but with the body found within Illinois, the FBI withdrew, leaving the investigation to state and local police, who had no new leads. The years turned into decades. The murder of Maria Ridulph became a cold case, a ghost that haunted Sycamore. For the Ridulph family, the grief was a constant, silent presence. The case remained a dark piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered by parents to their children. In 1997, a Sycamore police lieutenant, Patrick Soler, officially closed the case, naming a deceased former truck driver, William Henry Redmond, as the likely killer. Redmond was a suspect in other child murders and abductions from the 1950s, but the evidence against him in Maria's case was entirely circumstantial. Soler himself admitted that a conviction would have been impossible had Redmond still been alive. The case was closed but not solved, a semantic distinction that offered little comfort. Then, in 2008, a voice from the past reached out. It came in the form of an email to an Illinois State Police tip line. The sender was Janet Tessier, John Tessier's half-sister. She carried a story she had held for 14 years, a story that began with a deathbed confession. In January 1994, her mother, Eileen Tessier, lay dying of cancer. In a moment of lucidity, clouded by morphine, she had spoken words that had haunted Janet ever since. "Those 2 little girls, and the one that disappeared, John did it," Eileen had whispered. "John did it, and you have to tell someone." Janet believed her mother was talking about Maria Ridulph. Her older sisters, Catherine and Jean, had long harbored their own suspicions. They told Janet that their mother had lied to the police back in 1957, when she claimed John had been home on the night of the crime. The Tessier family was fractured. John, who now went by the name Jack McCullough, was estranged from his half-siblings. Jean had even accused him of molesting her as a child. Janet had tried to bring her mother's statement to the police before, but she was repeatedly dismissed. The original investigator, Patrick Soler, later said he never spoke with her, but admitted he wouldn't have suspected John Tessier anyway, given the family's ties to the police department and the fact that John had been cleared by the FBI. But this time, the tip landed with a cold case unit at the Illinois State Police, and they decided to take a fresh look. The investigation was reborn. State police detectives delved into McCullough's past and re-examined his alibi. They developed a new, tighter timeline. To make the 40-mile drive from Sycamore to Rockford in time for his 6:57 p.m. phone call, they theorized McCullough would have had to abduct Maria no later than 6:20 p.m. This contradicted the original FBI timeline, but seemed plausible to the new investigators. They also uncovered something that cast doubt on his original alibi. McCullough's former girlfriend from 1957 provided them with an unused military-issued train ticket from Rockford to Chicago, dated December of that year. To the investigators, this suggested that McCullough had not taken the train as he claimed, but had driven his own car. If he had his car, he could have driven from Chicago back to Sycamore on the afternoon of December 3rd, committed the crime, and then driven to Rockford. The most critical step was to see if the only eyewitness, Kathy Sigmund, now Kathy Chapman, could identify him. The investigators compiled a photo lineup. They used 5 pictures from the 1957 Sycamore High School yearbook. But John Tessier's photo wasn't in the yearbook because he had been expelled. So, they used a contemporary photo of him provided by his old girlfriend. The photo stood out. The 5 yearbook photos showed young men in suits against a light background, while Tessier's photo showed him in an open-collared shirt against a dark background. When presented with this lineup, Kathy Chapman, now in her 60s, pointed to the picture of John Tessier. "It's him," she said, identifying the man she had last seen over half a century ago. In July 2011, the net closed. Jack McCullough, now a 71-year-old widower living in a retirement community in Seattle where he worked as a security guard, was brought in for questioning. Aware of his law enforcement background, the Seattle and Illinois police used a professional interrogator. At first, McCullough was calm and cooperative, but when the questions turned to the murder of Maria Ridolph, his demeanor shifted. He became evasive and aggressive, and eventually refused to answer any more questions. He was arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridolph and extradited to Illinois. News of the arrest in one of the nation's oldest cold cases made national headlines. It seemed a miracle of modern forensics and dogged police work had finally brought a killer to justice. Maria's body was exhumed for DNA evidence, but none could be found. However, a new autopsy by a forensic anthropologist revealed something the original had missed. Nicks on her sternum and neck vertebrae suggested she had been stabbed in the throat at least 3 times. The trial of Jack McCullough began in September 2012. The DeKalb County State's Attorney, Clay Campbell, was initially reluctant to prosecute a case that was 55 years old and had no physical evidence. But pressured by the Ridolph and Tessier families, who were convinced of McCullough's guilt, he moved forward. The trial was a spectacle, a journey back in time. The prosecution's case rested on 3 pillars: Kathy Chapman's eyewitness identification, the testimony of McCullough's estranged half-sisters about their mother's deathbed statement, and the alleged lie about his alibi, and the testimony of 3 jailhouse informants who claimed McCullough had confessed to them while awaiting trial. However, the informant's stories were inconsistent with each other and with the new evidence that Maria had been stabbed. One said McCullough spoke of strangling her with a wire. Another said he smothered her. The defense argued that the entire case was built on a foundation of suggestion, family animosity, and faded memories. They pointed to the lack of any physical evidence, the absence of a motive, and the original, ironclad alibi that had cleared McCullough in 1957. On the advice of his attorneys, Jack McCullough did not take the stand in his own defense. On September 14, 2012, the judge, ruling in a bench trial, delivered the verdict guilty. Jack McCullough, at 73 years old, was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridolph and sentenced to life in prison. For Maria's family, it was a moment of profound relief and vindication. Justice, delayed for more than half a century, had finally been served. The case was hailed as the oldest cold case in U.S. history to be solved. McCullough appealed, and in 2015, an appellate court vacated his kidnapping conviction due to the statute of limitations from 1957, but upheld the murder conviction and his life sentence. The court did, however, rule that Eileen Tessier's deathbed statement should have been inadmissible as evidence, but it wasn't enough to overturn the verdict. From his prison cell, Jack McCullough continued to maintain his innocence. He filed a petition for post-conviction relief, acting as his own lawyer. The petition was initially dismissed as frivolous, but the story was not over. A new DeKalb County State's Attorney, Richard Schmack, had been elected, replacing Clay Campbell. When McCullough's petition came across his desk, Schmack decided to conduct his own, exhaustive review of the case. He read everything: the original FBI files, the new police reports, trial transcripts, and even books written about the case. And what he found shocked him. He concluded that Jack McCullough was, in fact, innocent. Schmack discovered that evidence which clearly established McCullough's alibi had been withheld or ignored at the 2012 trial. The most damning piece of evidence was the phone records. The prosecution in 2012 had suggested the collect call could have been made from Sycamore, or that the timeline was fluid enough for McCullough to have committed the crime. But Schmack went back to the source. He found newly subpoenaed, detailed phone records from Illinois Bell that proved, unequivocally, that the 6:57 p.m. collect call was made from a payphone in downtown Rockford, 40 miles away from Sycamore. Given the timing of Maria's abduction, which the FBI had placed between 6:45 and 7 p.m., and the icy road conditions on that December night, Schmack concluded it was physically impossible for McCullough to have been in Sycamore at the time of the crime. In a stunning legal reversal, Schmack filed a motion not to oppose McCullough's petition, but to support it. In March 2016, he stood in court and declared that a review of the evidence proved McCullough could not have committed the crime. On April 15, 2016, a judge vacated McCullough's conviction and ordered a new trial. That same day, Jack McCullough, after spending nearly 5 years in prison for a murder he did not commit, was released on bond. A week later, the murder charge was dismissed. The Riddle family was devastated and outraged. Their closure was ripped away, their belief in McCullough's guilt unshaken. They, along with hundreds of Sycamore residents, petitioned for a special prosecutor to be appointed to retry McCullough. But in August 2016, a judge denied their motion. The legal battle was over. On April 12, 2017, the DeKalb County Circuit Court issued Jack McCullough a certificate of innocence, officially declaring him an innocent man who had been wrongfully convicted. The case of Maria Ridolph, once celebrated as the nation's oldest solved cold case, is now once again unsolved. It is a story with two profound tragedies. The first is the brutal, senseless murder of a 7-year-old girl, a crime that has gone unpunished for over 6 decades. The second is the conviction of an innocent man, a life upended by a confluence of factors: a flawed photo lineup, unreliable jailhouse testimony, family turmoil, and the powerful, desperate need for a resolution, no matter the cost. The snow that fell on Sycamore on that December night in 1957 has long since melted, but the cold shadow of what happened on that street corner remains. The identity of Johnny, the smiling stranger who offered a piggyback ride and then vanished into the night with a little girl, is a secret the past has yet to give up. The search for justice for Maria Ridolph continues, a haunting echo in the quiet streets of a small town that has never been the same.